The way the world is consuming news is undergoing a profound shift. People, especially young people, are turning away from the traditional reliance on television to rely more on their smartphones, the web and social media. The Reuters Institute Digital News Report is the world's most extensive and comprehensive study of how news is consumed online. We've surveyed 30,000 people across 18 countries and produced 2 separate reports. Let's take a look at some of the key findings. TV remains the main source of news in most countries for most people, but smartphone use is up and it's becoming increasingly influential. Average use amongst the people that we surveyed in our first report, covering 12 countries, increased from 37% to 46% of people using a smartphone for news once a week. The rise of the smartphone means intensified competition for the home screen, and it means that mobile news is dominated by a few successful players. On average, people use 1.5 news sources on their smartphone each week. Mobile phone use and smartphone use is weighted towards the under 45s. And it leads to our next key finding, which is that this age group are turning away from traditional news sources, especially television, and relying much more on online, social media in particular, and Facebook. 41% of our survey sample used Facebook to find, read, watch, share or comment on news in the last week, and that's over double the nearest rival. Not all the trends we're looking are developing equally across countries. One area where we're seeing big differences between countries concerns participation and commenting on the news, where the Brazilians are most engaged and the Japanese least. Another area of key differentiation is trust. We see the highest levels of trust in countries with a good mix of public service broadcasters and robust commercial players. So whereas we see high trust countries in general, like Finland, and low trust countries and low levels of trust in news in general, like the US, what's particularly interesting is the differences between trust in the sources that people use, which are much higher, and trust in news in general. And there we see very big differences in the US and the UK. The reason for that may be twofold, really. Firstly, in both countries we have quite a politically polarised news environment. In the UK, we know that people, for example, as they read newspapers, they tend to read newspapers that they agree with and that reinforce their views. But if they want a trusted view, they tend to look at a broadcaster. In the US, we see the reverse phenomenon, where broadcasting is very polarised, but the press is much more neutral. But there too, we see this difference between a low level of trust in news in general in the US, but much higher levels of trust in the news that people use. So what are the implications of some of these findings? Firstly, if you're a news organisation, it's clear that getting people to pay for your content online is quite challenging. Just 6% of people in our survey in the UK paid for news last year, but there's more encouraging signs in Poland, where 17% of people had paid for news in the same period. There's also clearly a generational gap. TV is still the main source of news in many countries for most people, but how much will this change as young people move to rely more on their smartphones and as television overall is in decline? One thing is certain, there's going to be a need for some new business models explored by traditional news organisations. Digital is putting pressure on advertising as a source of revenues, and users are turning more to news aggregators and social media as a way of finding news. Those present great opportunities to reach new audiences, but it also means that news organisations need to work much harder to get the credit for the content they've produced. So what next are we planning for this report? Well, we had 13 sponsors for our main report, which covered 12 countries, and one of those sponsors, Google, also supported us to extend the main report to look at 6 other European countries. In 2016, we're going to cover 26 countries in the report. Our plan is to produce 8 new reports in the course of 2016 and various academic journal articles alongside the 2016 main digital news report. Our plan is to continue tracking and analysing how the world consumes its news and how this is changing how people are exchanging news, making money out of news and discovering news. If you want more information about the Digital News Report, you can go to the Digital News Report website, where there's interactive graphics, charts, video presentations of findings, essays and a full set of resources.